Mirrors and mazes. Respond to Media Watch, ABC TV. In 2017, ABC News continued to fearmonger catastrophic sea level rise predictions through selective reporting. Typical ABC, nothing has changed. Their show Media Watch ran an infamous segment 6 years ago, using the very same narrative. Media Watch discredited a number of people and organizations who dared question this doomsday prophecy. Well, let's have a look at that segment and see what the rate of sea level rise is today.
And now to a topic that shouldn't be the cause of partisan political argument, but unfortunately is.
Straight from the outset, Media Watch set the agenda for the segment.
This was a front-page article in The Australian the Friday before last.
Sea level rises are slowing, tidal gauge records show.
Exclusive, Stuart Rintoul.
It's all about a research paper published in March in the peer-reviewed Journal of Coastal Research. According to Stuart Rintoul,
the analysis by New South Wales principal coastal specialist Phil Watson calls into question the assumption of an accelerating rise in sea levels because of climate change.
At the time, and still to this day, the CSIRO fearmongered that sea level rise was getting faster and faster, meaning accelerating, and would rise 30 centimeters by 2100. But the tide gauges showed sea level rising steadily at 15 to 17 centimeters per century. They recorded, and continue to record, no acceleration. Phil Watson's paper supported the steady rise, and even a slowing of rate, meaning deceleration, which is what tide gauges indicate globally. Let's have a look at his paper. Watson's paper clearly found sea level rates consistently slowing for 80 years at 4 well-maintained tide gauge sites. Pause if you wish to read, as we will keep moving. Watson's paper states that his findings of deceleration are consistent with those by Dean and Houston in the US, as well as global records, well noted in the literature. Pause if you wish to read. Watson concludes there is discrepancy between the deceleration shown by long-term Australasian tide gauge records and acceleration predictions for future global sea level. Pause if you wish to read.
The analysis by New South Wales principal coastal specialist Phil Watson calls into question the assumption of an accelerating rise in sea levels because of climate change.
Well, as we'll see, Phil Watson disagrees that that's what his paper does.
Whoa, let's back that up.
The analysis by New South Wales principal coastal specialist Phil Watson calls into question the assumption of an accelerating rise in sea levels because of climate change.
Yes, that is exactly what it did. Watson himself concluded that the disparity must be rationalized, meaning to explain. Pause if you wish to read. Let's keep going.
But this much is uncontested. Mr. Watson's mathematical analysis of 80 years of tidal gauge records at 4 locations in Australia and New Zealand
finds there was a
consistent trend of weak deceleration
from 1940 to 2000.
A slowing, that is, in the rate that sea levels rose over that period.
That's right, and in the 6 years since this fake journalism show, the tide gauges still indicate deceleration.
The Australian's article goes on to quote
climate change researcher Howard Brady at Macquarie University,
who had some startling conclusions to draw from Mr. Watson's paper and from a similar American analysis published earlier this year. Dr. Brady, we're told, concludes that
sea level rises accepted by the CSIRO were
already dead in the water as having no sound basis in probability. This factual information means the high sea level rises used as precautionary guidelines by the CSIRO in recent years are in essence ridiculous,
he said.
Hardly startling. Dr. Brady was spot on. The CSIRO's doomsday predictions that sea level rise would double this century were not and are still not supported by tide gauge data. This is precisely what Watson's paper and the US analysis by Houston and Dean indicate.
Well, you can imagine how that story was jumped on by the proliferating websites devoted to debunking climate change science.
Ding dong, the climate witch is dead!
Jumped on? Rather, rightly supported by, and still correct to this day.
And by the talkback radio hosts with a similar agenda.
Oh please, this segment started by discrediting those who question catastrophic sea level rise. Let's keep going.
And this challenges, of course, all the predictions, including the corrupt CSIRO, that sea levels will rise because of climate change and they'll inundate Australia's coastline by 2100.
The corrupt CSIRO, says Alan Jones.
Jones was absolutely right. The studies blow the CSIRO's predictions out of the water.
In contrast, Dr. Howard Brady, interviewed by Chris Smith on 2GB later that day, is apparently one of
Australia's most prominent experts on sea levels.
The Australian tells Media Watch that it was Howard Brady, among others, who brought Mr. Watson's paper to its attention. And it says,
Dr. Brady was considered well qualified to comment on the potential deficiencies of scientific modelling compared to observable record.
Considered by whom, I wonder? True, Howard Brady is an
Honorary Associate.
in the Department of
Biological Sciences.
at Sydney's Macquarie University. But the head of that department, Professor Leslie Hughes, tells Media Watch,
My colleagues and I were concerned to see Dr. Brady referred to as a climate change researcher at Macquarie University in the Australian's article, as he is a retired paleontologist.
Hypocrisy at its finest. What is wrong approaching climate as a paleontologist? He is also a geologist. Hughes herself is an ecologist. Yet, she is quite happy to elevate herself to her proclaimed role of climate change researcher. Tim Flannery, with whom Hughes associates, is also a paleontologist, as well as a mammalogist. As Dr. Brady states in his book, Mirrors and Mazes, A Guide Through the Climate Debate, climate is a complex topic, embracing many disciplines, such as atmospheric physics, meteorology, solar and planetary physics, geological history, oceanography, ice sheet dynamics, plant ecology, and animal ecology. And on the 31st of January 2017, Dr. Brady, hosted by Chris Smith, 2GB Radio, explained why there is actually no such thing as a climate scientist.
There's no such thing as a climate scientist. There's so many different disciplines, but I'm really an historical geologist, and I think that's a very good way of approaching climate.
Okay, let's keep going.
in his retirement,
Nice try, he was not, and is still not near, retirement.
writes Professor Hughes, Dr. Brady has done work on his local beaches, but
He is not formally collaborating with any climate change researchers at Macquarie.
And thank God for that. Leslie Hughes is now a councillor for the Climate Council. Interestingly, Hughes's department did not renew Dr. Brady's tenure after this segment. The Climate Council is an alarmist organisation that predicts catastrophic sea level rise, more frequent and severe storms, and unchecked, rising temperatures. Their chief counsellor is Tim Flannery. None of his doomsday prophecies have eventuated. In May 2004 he said, "I think there is a fair chance Perth will be the 21st century's first ghost metropolis." In October 2006 he said, "There will be no Arctic ice cap in the next 5 to 15 years, with the ocean to rise by 6 meters." In June 2005 he said, "The ongoing drought could leave Sydney's dams dry in just 2 years." Let's keep going.
And he has not published any papers on this topic in the peer-reviewed scientific literature.
Oh please, he has, and he has also won an award for contributions to climate research.
asked about his credentials, Dr. Brady sent Media Watch a substantial statement. It's on our website. The nearest he comes to describing his scientific expertise
Oh please.
is this.
I am a qualified scientist interested in researching relationships between past and present environments, climates, and organisms.
The fact is that on the topic of sea levels and climate change, Howard Brady may be knowledgeable, but he's an amateur.
What a despicable ad hominem attack. The same year this fake journalism ad, Dr. Brady received the Distinguished Alumnus Scientist of the Year award from Northern Illinois University for contributions to climate research and to the community at large, a rare award for an Australian. He was on 4 expeditions to Antarctica with the US Office of Polar Programs. He has published scientific articles in periodicals, such as Journal of Glaciology, Nature magazine, and Science magazine. He since authored Mirrors and Mazes, a guide through the climate debate. On the 31st of January 2017, Dr. Brady, hosted by Chris Smith on 2GB Radio, explained why he was more than qualified to talk about climate, and why historical geology is a good way of approaching climate.
Tell us firstly a bit about yourself and what qualifies you to write about this issue.
Chris, I was an Antarctic scientist for a decade, and in 2011, Northern Illinois University in the United States gave me their Alumnus Scientist of the Year award for my contributions to climate.
Right.
So I've got a master's degree and a PhD in Antarctic environmental science and Antarctic history, so I'm more than qualified to talk about it. There's no such thing as a climate scientist. There's so many different disciplines, but I'm really an historical geologist, and I think that's a very good way of approaching climate.
Okay.
Let's keep going.
But what did the CSIRO have to say when he dismissed its sea level projections as dead in the water and, in essence, ridiculous? Well, unbelievably, Stuart Rintoul didn't bother to ask it for comment. When we asked the editor of The Australian why not, he replied only that,
as I understand it, the CSIRO was invited to comment to Media Watch and declined to do so.
well, Mr. Matheson, you're wrong about that. We got a comprehensive response from CSIRO sea level expert Dr. Kathleen McInnes.
Big deal.
As no doubt Mr. Rintoul would have done if he'd asked. She says that although Phil Watson's analysis of the data he has is useful as far as it goes, it
does not call into question the projections of the IPCC nor CSIRO, and so there is no basis for anyone else to make such assertions.
She explains why not in some detail. You'll find her full response on our website.
Why don't we actually look at that response? McInnes noted, Watson's study only looked between 1940 to 2000. She claimed, if one looks at a longer time frame, sea level rise is actually accelerating, particularly in the last 20 years. Pause if you wish to read. McInnes dismissed Watson's observed findings as limited only to regions of Australia and New Zealand. She touted in contrast IPCC projections, which the CSIRO follow, based on theoretical modelling applied globally. Pause if you wish to read. McInnes repeatedly claimed, sea level accelerated between 1880 to 2010, all over the world, particularly over the last 2 decades. Pause if you wish to read. So is the CSIRO correct? Has sea level really been accelerating for almost the last 200 years, particularly the last 20? Absolutely not. And, as you will see, how the CSIRO obtained their figures is a huge scandal that continues to this day. A faulty NASA satellite system, launched in 1992, is recording sea level rates double that of the tide gauges. The IPCC and CSIRO are adjusting tide gauge records before 1992, upward to the satellite system, and they then switched to the satellite records completely from 1992 onwards. This is precisely why the CSIRO record acceleration between 1880 to 2010, particularly in the last 20 years. Taken from one of his talks, Dr. Howard Brady explains what the hell is going on with the satellite corrections.
In 92, the Americans decided they would put up a satellite system also to measure sea level. Topex, Poseidon, Jason 1, Jason 2, and the last satellite to go up to replace those previously was Jason 3. The accuracy per run is only 2 centimetres. Over a century, that's a 2 metre error. But they hoped by a lot of iterations they would get their accuracy down. And what does the NASA satellite system show? It shows that sea level is now accelerating at twice the rate of the tide gauges. Now that's a pretty frightening clash. Who's right? We always think, at the moment, we're so technologically biased, we would presume the satellite is better. In 2011, the US Army Corps of Engineers analysed tide gauges throughout the world. They got all the data from the Australian CSIRO for down here. They had European data, American data. Now that Army Corps of Engineers, not just a few engineers under Jaunt, it's got an annual budget of $1.5 billion. It is a huge body of engineers. When they looked at all the tide gauges, they said, there's a problem with the satellite. The altimetry is out. There are indications that the satellite data is showing a double rate of increase and really overcorrected. They said it has serious design flaws. When that came out, people thought, oh, these guys are climate skeptics. There's a few tide gauges from the Liverpool database. Some of them look different. It depends on whether the data's averaged over so many months or over weeks or whatever. But none of it's curving upwards. In 2012, the head satellite design engineer for NASA in Pasadena, California, who has corresponded with me by email, came out and said the satellite system has serious problems. And we have now designed a system called GRASP, Geodetic Reference Antenna in Space, and we want to put that up because the clash between our satellite and the tide gauges is real, and we have altimetry problems. That submission was given to the US Congress, and unfortunately they still haven't got the funds to do it. That is a schematic thing on the internet where they're advertising their system called GRASP. 2014, two doctors, science from Caltech, again came out and said, look, Topex Poseidon weren't too bad in terms of analysing, agreeing with tide gauges, but the Jason series, we call them jumping frogs, are way to blazes out. And the trouble is that when NASA design a satellite system, they don't run it. They give a contract to a university, and the University of Colorado is running these satellites. On their website, you will find nothing about the fact that their system could be inaccurate. It is amazing, but it's true. Sorry. Now, how has the International Panel on Climate Change dealt with this? I've had a good look at all their meetings. The first one, 1990, Professor Warwick was chairman from the University of East Anglia, and Professor Earlmans from Utrecht, and go on and on. 2001, John Church from the CSIRO was chairman. All those early meetings, they looked at the history of the last century, no acceleration of sea level from the tide gauge data. They all said that. In 2007, with Professor Bindock from Tasmania as the chairman at the IPCC Sea Level Committee, they said, oh, the satellite is showing twice the rate of the tide gauges. Our models are showing acceleration. We must choose the satellite. The satellite's agreeing with the models. How bizarre is that? So looking at that graph there, you can see the steady as you go sea level rise, it is rising, and then the jump, the sudden jump, as if nature's going to do that so suddenly in the 90s when you put up a satellite. And Fort Denison, I've had great fun with this because I'm advising the Shoalhaven City Council, Senator Nowra, and they were using the satellite, and then I had a meeting with council, and then Mary King, the Chief Scientist of New South Wales, allowed councils to decide to take tide gauges rather than the satellite, which they did. The trouble is, if you look at Port Denison, one of the best kept tide gauges in the world, the Australian Tidal Council said it's never been over 9 centimetres 100 years. The National Oceanographic and Atmospheric Administration of the US looked at the data, the same. They said it was a bit lower. Notice here, the Manly Hydraulic Lab, which is New South Wales Government, the last 20 years it's dropped, it's decelerating. Whitehead Consultants, when they did this report for the Shoalhaven, they admitted the same. And the US Army Corps said that the CSIRO data showed that in recent years sea level is decelerating. Does the CSIRO tell you that? No.
So let's return to Kathleen McInnes. More hypocrisy. McInnes, CSIRO, and the IPCC go against their own mantra that climate models are not predictive tools. Pause if you wish to read. Even more hypocrisy. When IPCC met in 1990, 1995 and 2001, they agreed that sea level had been rising steadily, though they expected it to accelerate in the future, as per their models. Yet, McInnes claims it accelerated since 1880. She can't even get the CSIRO story straight with the IPCC. Pause if you wish to read.
Dr. McInnes adds,
CSIRO would have appreciated the opportunity to clarify what is a complex issue for many people.
Yes, please tell the Australian public how tide gauges are being adjusted.
We've received comments on Phil Watson's paper and the Australian's article from 5 other professional experts on sea level and climate change. 2 based in Australia, 1 in the US, and 2 in Britain. Those responses too are on our website. None of them agree with Dr. Brady.
All of those responses refuse to acknowledge that tide gauges all over the world show that sea level rises steady, and in the last 20 to 30 years, maybe even decelerating, meaning slowing down. Once again, Dr. Brady was absolutely correct.
Most of them point out that the slight deceleration that Phil Watson identified is a result of the particular time period he's dealing with. As Dr. John Hunter of the Antarctic Climate and Ecosystems CRC in Hobart told us,
over the past 20 years, observations of sea level rise have been well above the IPCC projections, by about 60%.
A 60% increase, over and above the already inflated acceleration projected by the IPCC, an utter fabrication from Hunter, who has always been a complete catastrophist.
The Australian says that Dr. Brady's opinions on Mr. Watson's article are
interesting, confronting, and newsworthy.
They certainly are. But the Australian should have made it clear that they're also, to put it mildly, highly controversial.
Reality is controversial. Observed tide gauge data is controversial. Oh please.
And as for Phil Watson, his employer, the New South Wales Office of Environment and Heritage, sent a letter to the Australian on the day the story was published.
Your article has misrepresented our Mr. Phil Watson's research paper by saying that global warming is not affecting sea levels.
The Australian points out that those particular words were used only in an online picture caption that's since been corrected. The article itself says the Oz did not misrepresent Phil Watson's research, so it hasn't published his employer's letter. It adds,
Phil Watson has made no complaint about how his research was represented in the article, and will not.
But the Office of Environment insists Phil Watson was indeed upset by the article, and his objections are pretty fundamental.
Mr. Watson does not agree with the use of his findings to infer future projections of sea level rise, nor does Mr. Watson agree that his research casts doubts on the future modelling undertaken by CSIRO.
Watson's paper absolutely cast doubt over CSIRO modelling, with he, himself, concluding that the disparity must be rationalised, meaning to explain. Pause if you wish to read. Phil Watson worked for the Office of Environment and Heritage, New South Wales Government. This department misrepresented Watson's findings. Watson did not personally write a response to Media Watch, from which you can draw your own conclusions.
The Australian tells Media Watch haughtily,
much of the commentary around this story has suggested that it was written with an agenda in mind. It was not.
Well, we don't have an agenda either.
Oh please, this segment started by discrediting those who question catastrophic sea level rise.
Except to hold the Australian to News Limited's own professional conduct policy. Here's one clause.
Try always to tell all sides of the story in any kind of dispute.
Media Watch failed to do this utterly. Worse still, they misrepresented people.
And here's another.
Individuals or organisations that have been criticised should be given a fair opportunity to respond.
It is an utter disgrace You chose not to look into the content of those responses.
Both of them, I reckon, well and truly flouted. If you're interested in what's admittedly a complex subject, I urge you to read the responses we've posted on our website. Our thanks to all the scientists, including Dr. Howard Brady, who took the trouble to answer our questions. Until next week, good night.
Media Watcher apologies to Dr. Howard Brady, Stuart Rintoul, The Australian, Chris Smith and Alan Jones, 2GB, Andrew Bolt, Climate Common Sense, CO2 Scientific, and No Carbon Tax. Well, what about today in 2017? Sea level continues to rise at a steady rate. Tide gauges worldwide still record no acceleration. The faulty satellite system still is in operation. NASA want to replace it, but can't get the money from Congress. The tide gauges and satellite records continue to diverge further. The IPCC and CSIRO still have their heads in the sand. The Australian public continue to be misled by the government and media. For more information about the faulty satellite, click the link to Dr. Howard Brady's talk, A Faulty Satellite Used to Predict Catastrophic Sea Level Rise, or go to the Mirrors and Mazes site.